really warm welcome this evening to our panel discussion on the general election. I'm Mike Kenny, Director of the Mile End Institute, major policy centre based here at Queen Mary, University of London. Our event tonight offers, I hope, a great opportunity for us to step back and look in some depth at what has been already a pretty extraordinary campaign, but also to look ahead to the result that we think, or our panellists think, may emerge from its outcome. This is the fourth event that we've held in our fairly short life so far. Our next is a seminar which will take place in the House of Lords, looking at the history of the Number 10 Policy Unit, which will involve Bernard Donoghue, who was its first head. So tonight you have a chance to put your questions about the campaign, about the parties, about the polls, about the strategies to our panellists. And after the discussion ends here, you are warmly invited to come and have a drink with us downstairs, where you can talk informally with them and each other. As usual, we have a hashtag for the event for those who want to share your thoughts on Twitter. It is hashtag MEIElection. And if all of this does not sate your appetite for discussing and thinking about the election, then you can go home and complete the short survey that's included on the Voter Advice app, which has been developed by academics based here at Queen Mary and some colleagues elsewhere, which you can find at Who Gets My Vote UK. And I gather nearly 25,000 people so far have already gone and done that survey, which is very gratifying. Before then, we will hear the views of our distinguished panel. I just want to offer them all my thanks for coming to participate this evening. They're all extremely busy, particularly at this point in time. I especially want to thank John Curtice, if I can, who's flown down from Scotland today to be with us. So let me now hand over to the chair of this evening's panel, BBC broadcaster and these days keen blogger, Robin Lustig. Thank you very much.
Mike, thanks very much indeed. Very warm good evening from me as well. If you want to look at the blog, it's called Lustig's Letter. Just Google it, you'll find it there. I'm going to take it as read that none of you think that this election is boring. You wouldn't be here if you did. I cannot believe that when I read in some of the newspapers that this has been a boring campaign. I cannot remember a more interesting, more unusual, more bizarre election campaign than this one. And of course, leading up to what next Thursday night, a mere 8 days away, will be an absolutely extraordinary evening, because nobody except these three people on the panel here have a clue what is going to happen on Thursday. We have a great deal to discuss, a lot of themes I'm sure that you will want to talk about. We will aim to end at around 8 o'clock. And then, as Mike said, there is a reception to which you are all invited. Let me quickly introduce my colleagues here. Professor John Curtice, University of Strathclyde, Professor of Politics, and a frequent guest of mine in BBC studios over many, many years. Mary Riddell, likewise, a frequent studio guest on every known radio and television outlet of the Daily Telegraph. Andrew Cooper, co-founder of the polling and research organisation Populus, and until about this time last year, Director of Strategy for David Cameron at Number 10. I'm going to ask each of them to say a few words just to get their vocal cords working, give us a few thoughts to ponder on, and then I'll open it up to you to ask questions. There will be a roving microphone. We'd be most grateful if you would wait for the microphone to reach you so you don't have to bellow and we don't have to strain. So let's start with John Curtice. John.
Thank you, Robin. I think I want to kind of start with a long lens, and then maybe I'll kind of shorten the lens as I go on. So I think first of all, I think it's worth thinking a little bit about, this is picking up your remark, why this election is so different, which in fact also therefore explains why it's also so difficult to forecast what's going to happen. And then secondly, maybe just talk a little bit about what has or hasn't happened during the course of the campaign, and with perhaps particular emphasis on events north of the border. My view is that this election is qualitatively different in terms of the context in which it's taking place, and certainly the structure of party competition within which it's played. I'm not sure that actually either of the two principal protagonists have adequately understood that, and that to that extent at least I'm not entirely sure that either of them has fought the right election campaign. But anyway, perhaps the one obvious place to start is Tony Blair's claim that that UK elections are won in the centre ground of British politics. And the truth is that this is not an election which is going to be won in the centre ground of British politics. Number one is British politics doesn't exist anymore. The truth is, I mean, even in 2010, the outcome of the election in Scotland was very, very different from that in England and Wales. The Labour Party actually gained votes, whereas it was getting a hammering south of the border. And the truth is that ever since really the wipeout of the Tories in 1997, Scotland has been on a different political trajectory with a different pattern of party competition. But it's also not about the centre ground, because clearly one of the crucial ways in which this election is very, very different from any of its immediate predecessors is, of course, that it's an election that's taken place against the backdrop of three surges. And those surges have undermined the classic political science assumption, which is, coming from Anthony Downs, that essentially in a two-party system you can compete in the centre and you can presume that you are not going to get enemies to your left and to your right. In this election, both Conservatives and Labour have enemies to their left and to their right, as a result of the three surges. Surge number one, of course, and in terms of shares of the vote, the most dramatic. And whatever happens next Thursday, UKIP have already claimed the crown of being the most significant, wholly independent, fourth party challenge in post-war English politics. And the wholly independent, by the way, deliberately excludes the SDP, who never fought elections on their own. UKIP look as though they may get 10, 11, 12% of the vote. I mean, this is phenomenal by UK historical standards and English historical standards. And UKIP, of course, at least in terms of its social profile, though not necessarily in terms of other aspects, but its profile on social issues is clearly to the right of the Conservatives. And what I think you particularly have to take on board, and which is one of the things I'm just not clear that the Conservatives have adequately taken on board, is that out of every 3 votes that the Conservatives have lost since 2010, 2 of them have been lost to UKIP. And insofar as the easiest votes for any party to try and gain an election campaign are the votes of people who voted for it 5 years ago but are no longer minded to do so, one could argue that the principal focus of the Conservative campaign should have been to try and get rid of UKIP, but it's not clear to me that that has been the principal focus. Because they, like the Labour Party, are still intent on trying to say to voters, the real choice is between us and the other lot. And they're doing so despite the fact that if you look at the historical record, voters have been increasingly saying, before the 3 current surges, no, it's not. Oh, we're going to vote for somebody else. Back in 2010, only 66% of all the votes cast were cast for Conservative and Labour, which was the lowest vote share since including 1922, i.e. which is the first election in which the Labour Party displaced the Liberal Democrats. And, 12 months ago, we were being told confidently by both sides, the UKIP bubble will disappear. Once people realise this is the real choice, it will go. And it hasn't. The second surge, which in a sense is perhaps the most surprising one, was the surge of the Greens. It started around the European elections. Hey guys, the Greens always do around European elections, but by August we usually forget about them again. This time we didn't. Why? Well, again, there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. The Greens are not the functional equivalent of UKIP. The Greens are not taking their support principally from the Labour Party, which a lot of commentators seem to assume. The Greens appear to be the principal beneficiaries of the further decline in Liberal Democrat vote that took place during 2014. The big decline, of course, took place in 2010. Tuition fees, complete disaster, one from which they are clearly not minded to forgive them. But in 2014, the further decline, almost undoubtedly instigated by the leader debates between Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg, which Clegg was widely judged to have lost. The Liberal Democrat vote goes down further. The Greens are the principal beneficiaries. And then, of course, there is the third surge. And the third surge is from the SNP north of the border. Actually, not quite so much of a surge, because the truth is that actually one of the things you will need to realise is that the SNP got 45% in 2011 in the Scottish Parliament election. It's a quasi-proportional representation system. They just about managed to get an overall majority. Quite an achievement, but the electoral system does make it difficult to get a majority. They got 45% in the referendum last September. You don't win a referendum on 45% of the vote. They went into the wake of that, they've rapidly emerged with about 45% of people in Scotland saying they're going to vote for them. That figure now looks as though it's increased. My current average is 50. But again, the crucial point is that 45% of the vote against a divided opposition under first past the post, and given the SNP's vote is geographically evenly spread, they just go walkies. So the crucial difference is, in a sense, there isn't a surge in Scotland. In a sense, what Scotland is going to do is to do what it's done twice already. But the crucial difference is that the rules of the game, created, of course, by Conservative and Labour, are now look as though they're going to bite both parties north of the border. Now, that said, however, you still have to explain why is it that a Labour Party that, at least in Westminster elections, was still capable of doing rather well, albeit it's long been in trouble in Scottish Parliament elections. And the answer is twofold, and it comes out of the referendum. What the referendum did is two things. One is it's made the issue of Scotland's constitutional status the defining issue of Scottish politics. There were lots of people in the past who were, at least mildly in favour of the idea of independence. They would tell parties that's what they were in favour of, but they voted for the Labour Party. Now that those people have put an X on a ballot paper saying, no, we want to get out, they're now minded to follow it up with a vote for the SNP. And the vast bulk of the votes that the SNP are going to get are people who voted yes. But there's also something else happened to the referendum, and this is why, again, it's not just that it's British politics that don't exist, because the truth is, for the people who voted yes in Scotland, they're voting about the future of Scotland. The referendum just means that for half the population of Scotland, the UK is no longer of interest. It's about the future of Scotland upon which they're focused, upon which the country debated intensely for 2 years. But the other thing that's happened again is that it's not the centre ground. And the thing you may not be quite so aware of, the people who are voted for Labour in 2010, who are now saying they're going to vote for the SNP, are to the left, even by Scottish standards. They want a more equal society. And the SNP, in their vision of Scotland that they promoted in the referendum, that included creating a more equal society. Now, their claims are disputed, but they've undoubtedly succeeded in persuading a significant section of the Scottish public that actually that's what they stand for. And therefore, the Labour Party is being hit by a party that is now regarded as being to the left of it, and which is therefore attracting voters. So the centre ground is not the point. The Tories' problem is UKIP to their right, and Labour's problem is the SNP to their left. And these two battles are not going on in a common British space. They're going on in two separate political spaces, one called England and Wales, in some cases probably excluding London, and the other Scotland. So that's, again, the crucial difference. Now, apart from that, and I can see you're beginning to look at me, there are other obvious things which make this election different apart from the surges. The first is that this is the first post-war election after a period of coalition government. It's also, of course, the first election to take place in the context of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. This is the first election in which the Prime Minister has not had any control over the timing of the election. And therefore, again, the way in which the election gets played out and how people vote and how people respond, in the past we basically assumed that nobody's heard of the Democrats for 5 years. All of a sudden we discovered there's this nice country of Democrats out there, the vote goes up in virtually every election campaign. Well, I think a lot of people feel they've seen far too much of the Democrats in the last 5 years, and they certainly therefore don't regard them as cuddly anymore, and therefore probably again the standard rules of British politics aren't going to apply. So there are many, many ways in which in effect this is a different ball game, and given also the polls are so close, it makes it very, very difficult to call.
John, thanks very much indeed. Gosh. Right, Mary Riddell.
Great. Thanks very much, Robin, and thanks to Mike and to John for that sort of magnificent overview of the background and what we might expect. I wanted to start off in rather more sort of humdrum settings, which is the hairdressers down the road from me in North London. I was in earlier getting my hair cut, and the stylist remembered there was some election going on and thought I might have something to do with it. When is it? She said. She'd forgotten, so I told her it was next week on Thursday. And she said, oh, well, normally by this stage, I kind of have a good idea who was going to win, because I ask my clients, I ask my ladies when they come in, and quite often they all say the same thing. But this time she said, I can't get an answer. They're all telling me different things. They're all going to vote for different parties. So I thought that view roughly accorded, with great respect to John and to Andrew, with that of most sort of political sophologists and indeed political pundits and columnists. We just don't know, and as John says, that's what makes it so very fascinating. Ed Miliband's going around his events telling people that it will come down to a few hundred votes in a few dozen constituencies. And the signs are that it may really be as narrow as that. I'm sure that David Cameron is saying roughly the same thing. And indeed, hoping for a replay of 1992, when the voters at the last moment decided that they'd stick with Nurse, that it was safer to stay with the devil you knew, and they voted in John Major. That may well happen again. The UKIP vote wouldn't have to collapse very much for the Tories greatly to benefit. And although, of course, John is completely right in his analysis about the threat from the left and the right, the fact is that UKIP will be lucky, I think, to get more than a tiny handful of seats. I think as few as one on Michael Ashcroft's polling, if I'm correct. Whereas it seems pretty certain that the SNP in Scotland will take a swathe of seats, perhaps 40 or so from Labour. The Tories, I'm sure, will benefit from a late surge, come what may. But this doesn't feel to me like 1992 all over again. I remember 1992. I was the duty editor of the Daily Mirror, a thankless task at the best of times. On the eve of election night, the night that the first editions came in, and there on the front page of The Sun was the head of the Leader of the Opposition with the headline, in a light bulb, with the headline around it, if Neil Kinnock wins today, will the last person in Britain switch out the light? The editor of the Daily Mirror was nowhere around. He'd already seen what was going on and gone to the pub. He'd realised before I did that the game was up for Labour. I don't think that feeling actually came at the last moment. The left were hopeful, but it seemed to me that the mood had started to change a few days out, and I don't really sense that that's happening this time. I should say, by the way, that I'm not for a moment saying that it was The Sun what won it. I don't believe the press has that power. I don't think it did then. Simply that a Tory victory was already in the ether. John Major had run a solid populist campaign, the sort of campaign I think that Ed Miliband is trying to run this time. And Labour, I think, are they seem quite confident. You know, if mood means anything, they've been reasonably sure-footed. And I think when Neil Kinnock suffered, Ed Miliband has actually benefited from a hostile press, my own paper, the Daily Telegraph being a huge contributor to this. He's been underestimated right from the beginning, and that's allowed him, I think, to go on television, to take part in debates, and actually turn in modest performances, and people say, my goodness, he's fine, you know, he didn't fall over, he's not roadkill. And perhaps we've been slightly misled. The Tories, on the other hand, I think, Andrew may well disagree with me, I'm sure he will, seem to have run a slightly uneasy campaign. There have been big things that haven't gone quite right. I suspect they would have hoped that their right to buy initiative attracted a bit more take-up, a bit more support. And then there have been the small telling details, like David Cameron forgetting which football team he supported, West Ham or Villa. I mean, it's tiny, it doesn't matter, it's the sort of slip-up anyone could make. But somehow it does have that smack of almost anyone could make. It does have that sort of smack of authenticity, you know. tend not to forget that I'm an Arsenal fan and think I'm a Spurs fan by mistake. But and I think people did think that was sort of slightly odd. Almost more interesting, I think, though, than who wins after all this, is what comes next. John's right, of course, that both leaders have rather miscalled the campaign, but I'm not sure anyone's really devoted very much thought to what the aftermath could be. If David Cameron gets 290 seats, then he's home and dry. He can cobble together, I would have thought, some sort of government. He wouldn't have a majority, but certainly enough to work things out. But if Labour wins fewer seats than the Tories, then what happens? There'd be a furor, I'm sure, over legitimacy, the need to invoke the help of the SNP, which raises another question, and that's disillusion, which has been right at the centre of this campaign. Distrust over the mainstream parties. People are fed up with politics. I found it interesting that actually, far from trying to counter that, the party leaders are all potentially stoking up more problems to come, more potential disillusion and disquiet after the election by making promises that they simply can't keep. Ed Miliband said he'll do no deal with the SNP, no coalition, that's fine. No supply and confidence deal, enabling him to get his budgets through and his key votes. Slightly easier in a fixed term, under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, but still. My suspicion is he'll have to do some sort of deal. Might be a covert deal, might be done behind closed doors, but the electorate will wonder whether he's being quite honest, should he win, in what he's told them. Similarly, David Cameron, today's 5-year lock on income tax, NI and VAT. He won't put taxes up. He will have to. If he doesn't, then on Ed Balls' calculation, which I accept that not everyone might take as being gospel truth, the Tories will have to find £46 billion in cuts, which would absolutely decimate public services. Somehow or other, they're going to have to put VAT up or something up. Otherwise, it simply won't work. Nick Clegg, for his part, has suggested he wouldn't do a deal with Labour if they were the smaller party, because that would be unconstitutional or whatever, which it wouldn't be. There's a precedent for that. The Lib Dems have gone into government on that basis before, and I'm sure they would again if they had to. Very last point. All of this means disillusion, rise of nationalism, which John's talked about, identity politics, means that the vote is splintering, and putting it back together, I think, won't be easy. However the fringe parties, the smaller parties, the insurgent parties perform this time. That in turn, I think, implies something quite serious about the state of our electoral system. The justification, the only final justification for first past the post, is that it traditionally always produces strong single-party government. It didn't last time. All the signs are that it won't again this time. Might do, we never know, but those aren't the indicators at the moment. So I think the rise of the insurgent parties, for me, are a kind of window on the future. If politics isn't to fall even further into disrepute, then it may be that this could be the last election fought on first past the post, that we'll have to go to some form of proportional representation. If that happens, I would think that this unwinnable election might produce at least one useful outcome. So.
Lovely, Mary, thanks very much indeed. You must have read my blog last week. Right, Andrew Cooper.
Thank you. I agree with much of what Mary said. Actually, they're not all of it. In the polling world, it's heresy not to agree with Professor John Curtice. He's a sort of godlike figure. Even the initials JC, exactly the same. I think from the Tory point of view, firstly, the whole Parliament really has been about the economy, and I think struggling for a clear economic narrative, really. From 2010, where there was a very broad and deep consensus that accepted that austerity was necessary, and people were sort of braced for cuts, and going through a phase where the language was that we're all in this together, which lacked any credibility. YouGov's weekly tracking polling shows two very telling horizontal lines throughout the Parliament. The proportion of people who thought that the government making spending cuts was necessary as opposed to unnecessary, completely flat all the way through the Parliament at about just under 2/3. And the proportion of people who thought that those cuts, though necessary, were being done unfairly rather than fairly, also completely flat at around 2/3. I think that sort of defined the Tory problem. They've struggled to persuade people sort of against the stereotype people have of the Tory brand, that they were doing the things that they were doing in as fair a way as possible, spreading the burden as fairly as they could, and doing it because it had to be done, not because they got a kick out of it. And I think as it's worn on, people have become, they haven't persuaded people of that. Second half of the Parliament, the Tories have moved on to the long-term economic plan language. The problem with that is that if you poll the question, do you think the long-term economic plan is working? Most people's answer is no. If you then probe that and say, well, who do you think it might be working for? Most people think if it's working for anybody, it's working for big businesses, wealthy, powerful people, and people in London, but it's not working for the rest of the country. It's not working for ordinary families. It's not working for me and my family. And it's certainly not working for struggling people. And so it's back to the long-standing problem the Tories have in persuading that people outside their core that the Conservative Party could ever represent their economic interests. Jim Messina, Barack Obama's campaign manager from 2008 and 2012, is advising the Conservatives in this campaign, not in message as Axelrod is for Labour, but more of the mechanics. But he constantly reminds them that all elections, he says, are referendums about the future. And I think much to the frustration of the Conservative leadership, no one's going to give you a reward for having sort of steered us through steady times now. And if we're in a situation which all the data says that we are, where most voters accept that the country's economy has turned the corner, but they themselves aren't feeling it yet, what that means if you're a voter is somewhere in Britain there's somebody who's doing well under Cameron's recovery, but it's not me. And so the election becomes a question of trust. Do people trust that if they put the Conservatives back into government, that under Cameron and Osborne, the continuing recovery would start to benefit ordinary people? And most people just aren't, they're not persuaded of that. And so they hang back in the balance. During the campaign so far, basically all that's really happened is if you plot all the polls this year, it's just a kind of knot of red and blue spaghetti. And basically all that's happened is the Labour and Conservative votes have hardened rather than grown. And there's now very little switching in the polls between the two of them, while the other third of the country can't stand either of them and is completely tuned out of the election. Robin said that he didn't think anyone could think this wasn't an interesting election, and it is. I mean, the dynamics, of course, are fascinating, but I think the dialogue is deeply depressing. It's said that one of the signs of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, and that is actually what they're doing, and they're both fighting very safe, very lifeless, very risk-averse campaigns, which have completely failed to spark with anyone at all. Mario Cuomo, the late Democratic governor of New York, once famously said that in politics you campaign in poetry and govern in prose, and this campaign has been entirely prosaic and lacking any poetry.
So we can look forward to them governing in poetry? Then
maybe not. I slightly disagree, although it's against the law of the polling world. I slightly disagree with John on the UKIP point. I think if you analyse what the Conservative Party's done during the Parliament, I think it's absolutely clear that they completely understood that for every 3 votes they'd lost, 2 of them had gone to UKIP, and they've tried everything. They've thrown the proverbial political kitchen sink at trying to get back those UKIP votes, and they have failed. I think it's very unlikely that we would face the prospect of an in-out referendum on the EU if the Tories are re-elected, were it not for the fact that the Tories have lost so many votes to UKIP. I think we saw a significant dialling up of the rhetorical position and the policy underlying it on the issue of immigration, and nothing worked. There's a very good book on the rise of UKIP called The Revolt on the Right by Matthew Goodwin and Rob Ford, in which they say UKIP could not have had a better recruiting sergeant than David Cameron. And I think that goes to fundamental truth, because one of the underlying drivers for UKIP aren't just the obvious policy issues of Europe and immigration. They're an underlying feeling about the country. They're a rejection of the modern world. They are a rejection of globalisation. They are a rejection of the pace of social change, and a rejection of the mainstream liberal establishment in this country, which is personified by David Cameron. I think what the Tories discovered was that, certainly, at least coming from him, it didn't matter what he said, that he was the problem, and they weren't going to believe that he really meant it. And nothing they've done. And I think one of the sort of slight pivots in the campaign was, I think towards the end of last year, they realised that they weren't going to succeed in getting many votes back from UKIP, and therefore they desperately needed to kind of trying to shift ground. I think probably 9 months ago, most people would have predicted that the Tory campaign would have been dominated by a right-wing appeal on immigration in Europe. And the reason it hasn't been, I don't think we've even heard them talk about immigration at all, is because they've conceded that they're not going to get many votes back from UKIP by that argument, in the same way that I think Labour have given up trying to get votes back off the SNP. And the reason why they're talking about it being about two parties, that the choice of two parties is not because they think they can ram people back into the two-party party apparatus again. It's because they hope that at least some of those UKIP voters will ultimately be susceptible to the squeeze message that however much you don't like Cameron, actually, if you think about it, you want Labour and Miliband even less. And obviously they've been using the threat of a weak Labour government with the strings being pulled by the SNP to try to achieve that. Now, relatively sane, sensible Tory MPs keep on telling me that on the doorsteps that's starting to work. There's not a shred of evidence in the polls that it's starting to work. I think they've shifted back from that back onto a positive economic message over the last week, where I suspect that they will stay. I think that both Mary and John have talked about the sort of splintering, and that is the other extraordinary part of the story of the Parliament. In the middle of the Parliament, when Labour had opened up a big mid-term lead following the omnishambles period, and had a lead consistently of 12 to 13% in the polls, since then, which was sort of the end of that peak was beginning of 2013, what's happened is the steady air coming out of Labour's tyres month after month after month, their lead drifting down from 12 or 13% to zero. And while that's happened, in net terms, none of those votes have gone to the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats. Mm-hmm. So it's a massive march away from the three established parties to anyone but the three main parties. I don't think that's necessarily as simple as the centre doesn't exist anymore. For some people, it's the system no longer represents their interests. But it's an incredibly profound problem that we face. It's very sobering reality that we don't currently have in this country a political party that appeals to a broad enough cross-section of the people to be capable of winning, as Mary pointed out, under the present rules. And I agree with her that if that continues, unless one of them can fix that problem, the current electoral system is untenable. And therefore we career along towards an almost inevitable car crash next week. The exact complexion and configuration which is in doubt, but incredibly close, quite small movements could make quite a bit of difference. But the certainty that we're going to end up with a very messy government, almost certainly a coalition, almost certainly a minority coalition, that has very little public goodwill, very little mandate, struggling to come up with a coherent programme for government, still having to take some very difficult financial decisions, which they've completely failed to be honest about to the voters. So it's not a happy prospect, and all those underlying issues that have got us to this mess will remain and will have to be dealt with.
Oh, you've cheered us up now, haven't you? Thank you. Actually, before I throw it open to you, I just wondered if I could focus a little bit. Mary, you used the word disillusion, and then Andrew, you, in what you've just been saying, talked about it a little more. And I just wanted to throw in an anecdote from one of the many elections that I reported on. This one was actually an Israeli election many years ago, when I asked an Israeli journalist how he would explain the extent of disillusion that I picked up among voters at that time. He said, oh, no. He said, it's not disillusion, it's disgust. And I wonder whether what we tend to describe as disillusion with the main parties actually goes beyond that, whether it is actually disgust. It is a feeling that Nothing that these guys say will I believe.
Yes.
They can promise me £1 million at breakfast tomorrow, and I wouldn't believe them. And they see this as partly as coming out of the financial crash, when none of the politicians warned them it was going to come. They see it in part coming out of the expenses scandal, when they saw that they were all cheating the system. Labour Party voters, some of them see it coming out of the Iraq War, when they believe, some of them, that Blair lied to them. John, can I ask you, I mean, do you think it does go beyond disillusion, and that there is a genuine feeling which helps to explain the UKIP rise, the SNP rise, the Green rise, which is discussed?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true we don't particularly trust our politicians, and I suspect some UKIP voters are disgusted with the promises that were made over immigration, which we know were not being fulfilled. And certainly equally, there are people in Scotland who are disgusted about the fact the Labour Party fought a campaign in hot with the Tories. That much is true. I think I'd come at it slightly differently. And in a sense, the way I would put it is this, is that I think if I invite everybody in this room, and I gave you 6 pieces of paper, and I said, what I want you to do on the first 3 pieces of paper is to write down for me the kind of country that UKIP want to create, the kind of country that the Greens want to create, and the kind of country the SNP want to create, I reckon you could probably do the task fairly fast. If I then give you the task and say, what kind of country does David Cameron want to create in 5 years' time? What kind of country does Ed Miliband want to create in 5 years' time? And what kind of country does Nick Clegg want to create? And I think you find it an awful lot more difficult. One of these, remarkable things about the last few years is that the 2 principal protagonists for prime ministers are quite clear failures in terms of their ability to articulate a broad vision which is consistently becomes part of a wider narrative. So, David Cameron had the Big Society. Remember the Big Society? Yeah. Ed Miliband, and we've had One Nation Labour, predators and producers, responsible capitalism. It's all gone. And they're all, again, one of the fascinating things about this election is the degree to which they all think, well, if I come up with one more policy wheeze, I'll finally get there. And the truth is, the whole is less than the sum of the parts for these parties. They cannot tell it into a broader narrative, whereas the SNP have a narrative. Nigel Farage, you may not like it, but he has a narrative, and the Greens have a narrative. So I think this is the issue. It's the inability. It's that again, it's partly that again, if you go back through the history of British polling, I think Andrew, I don't think he'll disagree with this. It's very difficult to find a previous period in which all 3 party leaders were basically regarded as at best and at worst useless. All right. Or to put it slightly differently, if you go back through the history of Britain, at least there was always Jeremy Thorpe in the past. There was always somebody at least
Great example.
who was capable of attracting the attention of the public, who as a result ended up being relatively popular. But we've had Miliband, who for most of this parliament, only Michael Foot has saved him from the wooden spoon of opposition leaders. We've had Nick Clegg, quite clearly, the most unpopular Liberal Democrat leader we've had, including David Steele when he was part of the Lib Lab Pact. And we've had David Cameron, who just basically, he's kind of moderately unpopular. And our charismatic politicians, right, well, where are they? They're in Scotland with Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. They're in Brussels with Nigel Farage. They're in London with Boris Johnson. And they're deep on the back benches with George Galloway, but they're not on the front benches of any of the Westminster parties.
I've never heard anybody suggest, I don't think until now, that what we need is more party leaders who then end up being charged with conspiracy to murder at the Old Bailey. But anyway...
Could I just put in a word for the non-charismatic politician? Although he's a dear colleague of mine, of course, I think Boris Johnson does have some shortcomings. And equally, the last charismatic politician who came in on a sort of wave of glory was Tony Blair, and look how that turned out.
Sure.
So I think that
But voters like charismatic.
Exactly.
well, they do, but this is why all these sort of parties of national identity have this wonderful sort of prelapsarian vision, some kind of golden age, the sort of utopian thing that John was talking about. Then if you can go back to your disgust and contrast it with the boring campaign that Andrew was describing so well. On one hand, you've got this rather sort of unformulated but very attractive sort of idyll. On the other hand, you've got incredibly, I mean, politicians are always disingenuous, to throw another dis into the mix. But for instance, you had Ed Miliband this morning on a platform sort of talking about Tory cuts and how terrible they were going to be. And all the journalists stood up and said, well, what are you going to cut then? Of course he wouldn't say. He'd say, oh, well, you know, the IFS are much keener on our sort of cuts than anyone else's, which they aren't. And so you've got this slightly incoherent vision contrasted with the extreme dullness on the other side. I don't think any of those three leaders are actually bad. Nick Clegg seemed to me quite an attractive politician in his time. Ed Miliband isn't bad. David Cameron has considerable presence. I just think that they're slightly wrong for the sort of politics
And they all look the
people want
same.
at the moment. They all look the same.
Andrew, you talk to, or your company anyway, talks to an awful lot of voters. Do you pick up disgust?
Yes, I think you've a lot of disgust, but I think underlying it, one of the thing which the common appeal of the SNP and the Greens and the UKIP, there is a kind of worldview. What they're all offering in their way is simple solutions to complex problems.
Of which Russell Brand then becomes the extreme example.
But against which you have, and people go to them in frustration because what they see is three main parties who, what the voters say is, they don't tell us the truth, and guess what? The reason why they think that is because they don't tell them the truth. What I often make is that the Conservative Party was fond of making the point, which may or may not be technically true, that throughout the 13 years of Labour government, for every £4 that was spent, £1 was borrowed, and that's how we got into the financial mess. But if you flip that round, what that means is the voters were getting £4 of stuff and only paying £3 for it, which is a really good deal. And unsurprisingly, the voters want to continue. And the central problem at the heart of our politics, which Mary's just alluded to, is the political parties aren't willing to tell the voters, you can't have all the stuff you want and only pay what you're willing to pay for it. Something has to give. And so they indulge in the sort of the search for the unpopular groups and individuals who we can pretend that we can get to pay for everything and not have to face up to any difficult choices. And they have different lists of who the unpopular people are depending on where they are on the spectrum. But they're not willing to confront the actual truth. And the voters aren't stupid. They know that. And so they see people posturing to offer sophisticated, complex solutions to complex problems, but they never work. And so in frustration, they look to people on the fringe who offer simple solutions to complex problems.
And it's interesting, of course, that this isn't a uniquely British phenomenon. I mean, you see it in many, many different European countries where parties that were regarded as completely beyond the pale now find themselves either in government or very close to it. Anyway, let's see. Put some hands up, people who want to. Golly, lots. All right, well, let's start at the back. There's a lady there and there's a gentleman there. Wait for the microphone to reach you. Yes? I'm still pointing very rudely.
Hello, Sarah Cox from Goldsmiths. I understand there's quite a real chance that Nigel Farage won't win the seat he's contesting, and potentially Nick Clegg could lose his seat. I just wonder what to everyone on the panel, what your thoughts were on the future for both UKIP and the Lib Dems, if one or both those
The parties
things
rather
happen.
than the individuals?
Both, actually,
Both.
yeah, parties and the individuals.
Right. All right, Andrew, do Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage have futures if neither of them are in the House of Commons?
And as you said, I mean, the polls, there are two more polls out today in each of those constituencies from Lord Ashcroft. He's got the Conservatives 2% ahead of Farage in Thanet, and he's got Nick Clegg 1% behind Labour in Sheffield Hallam. All the polls in Sheffield Hallam, they're increasingly close. They've been a narrowing race, but he's still behind.
So you could have two headless parties.
You could have two headless parties. I think actually Sheffield Hallam will be one of the most important results to watch on the night, because if Nick Clegg does lose, I think it becomes significantly less likely the Liberal Democrats will go back into coalition with the Conservatives. And I think we'll see a lot of Tories voting tactically to try to save him on Thursday.
So a defeat for Clegg in Sheffield Hallam could actually colour the shape of the next government?
Yes, very much so. I think actually the most of the political press significantly understated the significance of what Nick Clegg said on Friday about his position in respect of. He said that the Liberal Democrats would not support a Labour government that was dependent upon the SNP because the SNP is not committed to the union, and since it's almost impossible to construct a scenario in which Labour and Lib Dem could be a majority on their own, that means he'd all but
Yeah,
he'd all be ruled
dependent's a
out.
fairly woolly concept, though, isn't it?
Yes, but I think a common sense interpretation of what he said is that unless Lib Dems and Labour were a majority, he wouldn't want to do, or the small number.
But a
of
different
elected,
Lib Dem leader might.
I mean, what happens next? Tim Farron is the book's favourite to replace Nick Clegg, but most of his parliamentary colleagues regard him as a buffoon. So I think he's quite unlikely to end up winning. The other issue, of course, is if he's lost, and what it could be that while we're still trying to pick up the pieces and put together some kind of coalition arrangement, you have a leaderless party. Vince Cable, I think, is the deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats.
No, he's not. No, it's Malcolm Bruce, and Malcolm Bruce is standing down. So
Standing down, so
the
they'll have
parliamentary
one.
party would have to elect a leader.
Before the coalition negotiations?
Yeah.
Well,
Which, of course, would take a very long time.
yeah, because it's a complex
That's
process.
Short. That's short. No.
Wow.
I mean,
No, pro tem, I said. The parliamentary party will elect a leader.
Oh,
pro
I
tem.
see. Oh, okay. Mary?
Well, Farage and Thanet South, Sarah, I have no feel for that. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Nigel Farage were to lose it. I come from Boston in Lincolnshire, which is yes, so which is another one, which is pretty neck and neck. It's held by the Conservatives now. I would be very surprised if UKIP were to take that. Seems to me, just from going back and the sort of conversations you have, that the UKIP vote there is quite soft. Now, Thanet, I don't know, but I think Farage could well lose it. If he does, he's said that I think that that's it. Yep. He'll no longer lead the party. And UKIP may start to look very small indeed in parliamentary terms. Clegg and Sheffield Hallam, I totally agree with Andrew, is the really interesting result of the night. Labour think, for what it's worth, that Nick Clegg will hold it just. I think they genuinely think that, but part of that is wishful thinking, because although, in a way, the last thing the Labour Party wants is Nick Clegg there, because along with Danny Alexander, who will surely lose his seat in Scotland, and David Laws, these are the old sort of orange book people who would much rather be with the Conservatives. The rest of the party, rather different, much keener on a Labour alliance. But there's the headless chicken thing, which John's alluded to. You know, the Lib Dems take their conclaves to elect a new leader are interminable. We'd be halfway through the next parliament before they got anyone sorted out. So I think on balance, of course, Labour won't necessarily get what they want at all. But I think they'd quite like to see Nick Clegg there, even though they could do much better business with the party without him. My hunch is he might just hold Sheffield Hallam, but who knows?
John, your hunch?
Well, I mean, the truth is that neither Sheffield Hallam and Thanet South are both too close to call. That's the only sensible interpretation of the polling evidence, because after all, just a week ago, Salvation published a poll in Thanet South which had Farage 7 points ahead or whatever it was. So, and constituency polling is actually quite difficult to do, etc., etc. So, it's obviously pretty close. I think Farage matters more to UKIP than Clegg does to the Liberal Democrats. All right. If Nick Clegg disappears down the tubes in Sheffield Hallam, well, it will just be part of a broader wreckage for the Liberal Democrats. But the truth is, the party will survive. UKIP, on the other hand, are very clearly very dependent on Farage in terms of their ability to be able to project themselves. The research evidence suggests that he's very crucial in attracting voters to the parties. If he gives up the ghost, now I think the truth is, UKIP have acquired some quite astute politicians amongst their senior leadership, but there isn't anybody with the charisma and appeal of Farage. Now, the truth is, however, I think the future of these two parties to some degree are bound with each other. And again, I would argue that one of the reasons why UKIP are where they are is it's one of the unintended consequences of the Liberal Democrats going into coalition. Because you can date the rise of UKIP very, very precisely to the spring of 2012, when the Tories suffered omnishambles, which is the moment when the Tory vote goes down. And there was always going to be a question about, well, what would happen when the Tory party hit the electoral rough waters, and there weren't Liberal Democrats left to act as the protest party, and UKIP seized the opportunity. Therefore, I think, therefore it kind of, the future of UKIP also depends on, if the Liberal Democrats go into coalition, then UKIP is still going to be kicking around even without Nigel Farage, because the point is, where else are people going to go, particularly if the Lib Dems are in coalition with the Tories. If, on the other hand, the Lib Dems get out of government and therefore have an opportunity to perhaps to recreate themselves as a protest party over a couple of years, then there will be competition for UKIP in a way that will make its future more difficult. So to that extent, at least, I guess, the ideal for UKIP is that both Clegg and Farage survive, but that actually whether or not Clegg survives may be quite important also to the future of UKIP.
And do you have the timetable of election night in your head, John? Do you know how long we have to stay up to know Sheffield, Hallam and Thanet South?
I don't know precisely when either of those are. All I can tell you is I have an editor who is deeply worried that he's got very little to say until 2 o'clock in the morning. Because of the coincident local elections in virtually the whole of England outside of London, the count's going to be relatively slow. And, we'll get Sunderland and one or two others, but actually getting London will be relatively early, but we will be, it could be a kind of, if it's really, really tight, to be honest, the markets could open before we're sure who's got most seats.
Gentleman up the back there.
Thanks. To take for granted that the election will be decided by a couple hundred votes in a few dozen close seats, to zoom in on polling day, how big an impact do you think the relative demographic of party membership will be? So the Labour Party membership is, broadly speaking, young, and there are more of them. The Conservative Party membership is old, and there are fewer of them. To what extent is Labour's ability to get more people out on polling day going to shift the election?
Andrew?
That is a good question. I mean, one of the things the Ashcroft polling data reveals is Labour have built up a huge advantage in terms of voter contact across the battleground seats. But we went through and did a seat-by-seat analysis and found actually that it's one of my more statistically literate colleagues told me it was a perfect textbook example of a zero correlation. In other words, there are exactly as many of these constituencies where Labour are doing worse than national swing, despite the voter contact, is where they're doing better than national swing. So voter contact itself is a very poor proxy for swing. However, what they are doing is identifying greater numbers of Labour voters in those seats, and if they have the field force on the day to turn out those votes, that could give them an advantage. When the Conservative profile, as well as being old and fewer of them, of course they're also richer. So one of the interesting questions about this campaign, I think, one of the big differences from past campaigns is in previous elections, the whole country used to be plastered with billboards, particularly by the Tories, who would spend millions of pounds on it. And there aren't any billboards in the country at the moment, which begs the question, what are they doing with all their money?
There are in Scotland.
Oh, are there?
Yeah. The SNP have got billboards.
Yeah, but the Conservatives who don't, who typically spend £4 or £5 million on them. And the answer is they're spending their money on a essentially invisible targeting campaign using social media, applying the insights that Jim Messina has brought from the Obama campaign. Now, we won't be able to tell until afterwards whether that worked, but their attempt to trump the fact that they're outmanned in a lot of the key seats in terms of people is to try to use more sophisticated targeting methods and use social media and social networks to try to get the turnout.
I'm interested that you talk about social media, Andrew, because I spend most of my waking hours on the social media of one kind or another, and I haven't really seen the evidence. No.
Because and I say, it could be all bluff, and it may, and we'll only be able to tell at the end. But the point of it is, it's very targeted. Okay. It's the acquisition of masses and masses of data, the acquisition of consumer data, the acquisition of polling data, the fusing of it all together to identify individual people who they believe will be susceptible to particular messages, and then trying to contact those people through the conduits of their friends on social networks.
I feel quite hurt.
So I think you've just outed yourself as not a Tory target.
John, if I can move away a little bit from the question that was asked, but social media, do you see evidence that it's playing a significant role?
No, but of course, as Andrew said, it's invisible. Two points to make, and I will come back to the question. The first is that in the Scottish referendum, the yes side was far more active on social media than the no side. It didn't win them the referendum. Certainly at the aggregate level, it's perfectly clear that Labour supporters are more active on social media than Conservative supporters. Yes. I'm not clear that's going to win them the election. The truth is that people of a certain ideological disposition just seem to be more obsessive than those of other different ideological dispositions. Coming back to the question on turnout, however, most opinion polls, not unsurprisingly, given the differences in the age profiles of the two parties. So, I mean, one of the things that's quite important at the moment is that the Labour Party are much more successful in getting younger voters and older voters, conversely for the Tories. But of course, older voters are more likely to turn out to vote. Most opinion polls find that Conservative voters are more likely to turn out to vote than Labour voters. But before you jump to conclusions that therefore the opinion polls will be wrong, most opinion polls are already factoring that into their estimates, and whether they're doing so sufficiently or not is another matter. But I think probably, at the aggregate at least, turnout will favour the Conservatives. Again, of course, then we come to the niceties of the electoral system. It's long been true that turnout in Labour constituencies has been lower, and therefore Labour voters less likely to turn out. But that doesn't make a difference to the outcome of the election because Labour still wins the seats. So the crucial thing is, where is there the differential turnout? And that's where it's the marginal seats that becomes crucial.
Sorry, Mary.
Oh, no, I was just going to say very quickly, there's things like weather too. I think some people in Labour are praying that it'll be sort of a wonderful sunny day down here and kind of hailstones the size of boulders up where John is to keep the Scottish turnout down to an absolute minimum. I was just going to add that Labour voters, of course, as you rightly say, are younger, young voters, much less likely to vote than older voters, but also just on Robin's social media point, for all that it's very important, I think where Labour really is coming through, and Andrew mentioned it, in some but not all seats, they've got a really good ground operation going. They had a guy in called Arnie Graf, who was an old community organiser from America, who worked very briefly with Obama long ago. And he kind of got all this going. I think he had some visa problem in the end, went home. But they do have a good ground operation, and that's why some of the polling, national polling, may not tell us all that much, because there's going to be so much that depends just on seat to seat, and I think it's really very hard to read that. Lord Ashcroft's had a go.
I was interested, though, a few weeks ago when Grant Shapps was, as usual, in the news. The story on this particular day was that he had been caught out in a lie, having claimed always that he'd abandoned his alter ego, Michael Green, as soon as he was elected, and in fact he hadn't. And Labour put together an immediate and quite funny video just contrasting what he had said at various times. And it was quite a punchy little YouTube sort of 90-second, 2-minute video. I thought, aha, this is a sign of things to come. And it wasn't, because they haven't done it since.
No, I think one of the things that's happened is that the degree to, in case it comes back to the poster point, the degree to which people on social media can quickly turn what looked like a brilliant poster into a counterpunch has made it less popular. So I mean, the posters about, I mean, the one about Alex Salmond having Ed Miliband in the pocket. I mean, the SNP soon turned it around, and I think I'm afraid the arresting visual image has been destroyed by the power of social media, I suspect.
Yeah. Okay, there was a gentleman here. Yep, down here, please, and then a gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Adam Smallman. My household is a superheated vessel of politics at the moment, leading to divorce. My wife, who has never voted Tory and would never vote it, said that she would consider it if they hadn't offered up the EU referendum, which she thinks is an utter disaster. I will vote Tory reluctantly, despite agreeing with her on that point. And my 11-year-old daughter brings a piece of vernacular from the playground and will vote Green because she believes that all of them are engaged in pinky promise. My question is, Andrew, actually, aimed at you. If the Tories decide to put Boris as their leader, will that show that they haven't understood what's going on in politics?
Or that they have.
Well, Boris obviously he's a phenomenon, and as John alluded to in his earlier remarks, I mean, Boris is one of the very few popular politicians we have. He's one of the very few politicians who voters think is authentic, who voters think says what he really thinks, is kind of unspun in a way that they crave. Whether he's actually authentic or unspun, I think, is a matter of opinion. I think there's two. I mean, the appeal for him is obvious, but it is that authenticity. He's got box office appeal in a way that nobody else has, and at least on paper, having won 2 elections in London, which is not a Tory-friendly city, the ability to, you can't win in London without going beyond your base and reaching across party lines. However, people's perception of the job of Mayor of London and what it takes to be Mayor of London is very different, I think, from their perception of what it takes to be Prime Minister. I think there is an issue for Boris over can he go beyond the kind of comedy shtick? Can he do the sort of solemn, serious bits of the job? Can people imagine Boris Johnson addressing the nation solemnly after some awful terrorist event? Or,
may I just interrupt on that point? Because I think I don't think you've understood my.
No, I have understood. I'm going to move on to. But because it's very common at the moment. There's a sense, I think, that Boris is kind of unstoppable force because I think that there are other issues with it. But I think because, as I said earlier, I think the central problem the Tories have is on the economy, persuading people that it can represent the economic interests of ordinary people. And my point was that while they may be tempted to get bowled up in the sex appeal of Boris and the apparent charisma and the ability to reach outside, I think the moment that he is no longer just the laughable, affable Mayor of London, but is now the candidate for Prime Minister, it may suddenly matter a lot that he is also another Bullingdon Club member, Old Etonian, and who may actually reinforce in people's minds the inability of the Conservative Party to speak to the interests of people who are not rich and didn't go to Eton and weren't in the Bullingdon Club.
So who should?
Andrew, then, who is your candidate to be the next leader of the Conservative Party?
I don't have a candidate.
Maybe that's the problem. There isn't one. Anybody who fits your specifications.
I suspect that it won't be Boris. If I had to bet on it, I suspect it will be Sajid Javid, the Culture Secretary. Who at least has a sort of backstory. He's the son of a bus driver, and he's a self-made merchant banker who's extremely prosperous. And,
so which one would George Osborne back?
George Osborne will back the winner.
Is it worth just saying, too, that I suspect the very last thing in the world that Boris Johnson wants, and I certainly haven't talked to him about it, is to be leader of the Conservative Party were David Cameron to lose this election. 5 years of Boris as opposition leader when he's still Mayor of London, I mean, it would be an absolute nightmare for him. I suspect the gloss would come right off Boris and he would find it perhaps quite a tough climb to be Prime Minister were that to happen.
Yeah, next question. I'll leave you.
Yeah.
It's on.
Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. That's okay. I'm Richard Allen. Looking at the way the polls are suggesting it's going to be very tight, and the way the leaders are saying there's not going to be any formal agreements between them, and we've got a prospect of a minority party trying to do ad hoc agreements as they go along. So I'm looking at the prospects of what we could have, and I'm seeing it that there's only one party that could swing each side with different votes. There's one party that could have some votes that would need a right-wing leaning and others a left-wing leaning, and that's Labour, because they've got SNP one side and we've got Tories on the other. So, you know, for instance, we want the budget for Trident renewal, then the Tories would vote for that and SNP would vote against it. The Tory party can't do that.
You're suggesting it's much more likely that Labour would lead such an ad hoc minority government than the Tories. Is that?
Yeah, I'm just saying that's the one feasible, if it is that tight, that Labour could just survive on an ad. They do have to get through the Queen's speech problem. They're going to the Queen and getting and saying I can lead a party. That is a hurdle for them. But once they've got that, they could play proper multi-party politics like happens in a lot of other countries.
Okay, leave it there. And let's
So comments, please.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is the Labour Party has more potential and more reliable friends than does the Conservative Party when it comes to forming administration. But I think behind your question, there's also an important point which has kind of begun to emerge in the last 2 days. I mean, the truth is there's a bit of a conspiracy of silence between the SNP and the Tories, which they don't want, neither of them want voters to cotton on to. The conspiracy of silence on the Conservative side, which Michael Fallon tripped over yesterday, is that, of course, if we do have a minority Labour government, which in theory is dependent on the SNP, the only reason why the Scottish tail will wag the English dog is if the Conservative Party allows it to do so. All right? The truth is, if we have a minority government can try to negotiate the passage of its legislation with any of the opposition parties, and that's the biggest of the opposition parties, and I think we can all probably agree the Tories in these circumstances would be the largest of the opposition parties. They clearly potentially have an awful lot of clout, but the Tories don't want us to think that. Equally, of course, also the SNP don't want people to realise that the only way they will ever have leverage in this circumstance is if they're willing to vote with the Tories. Exactly. All right? And of course, indeed, on issues like Trident, they won't necessarily have very much leverage at all. Now, I mean, I think it also finds this kind of game where I would kind of say, look, I think actually, in certain circumstances, even with what looks like a very messy Parliament, things could resolve themselves very, very quickly. And I think it goes as follows. If indeed it's perfectly clear that even if David Cameron could persuade all of Nick Clegg and his friends and Nigel Dodds and his friends, and maybe even also kind of, a nod and a wink to Nigel Farage if he's there, he still couldn't make it. And that's a pretty disparate group of people he's trying to keep together. If he's clear that he can't, and that whereas on the other hand, Labour plus the SNP is a majority, Labour plus Lib Dem isn't, then it seems to me what happens is fairly obvious. The only possible government is a minority Labour government. And because the SNP have already said we'll keep Cameron out and we want Labour in, there's no need for negotiations in advance of the Queen's speech. All right? And if you want to know what it will be like, go back to the 1970s, which is the last time we had a minority Labour government after Labour lost its majority. For a while we had a confidence supply arrangement with the Liberal Party, and then that eventually fell through. And the Labour government in the last few months, until it eventually came a cropper in March 1979, survived by doing deals with the Northern Ireland Unionists and with the Nationalists. Go back to the 1970s. Get your haircuts out, your sideburns, etc. Because that's what we're going back to.
The reason it came a cropper in 1979 was that it was brought down by one single vote, Jim Callaghan's government, by the SNP. That is a long folk memory, I think, in Scotland. And perhaps Labour pin rather too much on it, but there is some feeling. I think the circumstances are perhaps quite propitious for a minority government. The Fixed Term Parliament Act makes it much harder. A vote of no confidence, for example. You can't just say, there's no confidence in you, out you go. It has to be very sort of formally framed. So that, I think, is a sort of security. But really, there is the feeling that the SNP wouldn't want to bring down a Labour government. And I don't think they would, certainly in the first instance. They're not going to rocky any boats until after their own elections in 2016, whether you care to rely on it for the whole Parliament. Plus, there's a psychological factor, I think. You get a lot of minority parties who have suddenly got seats in Parliament, and they think, blimey, here we are. Yep. And so their first instinct would not be to bring down the government on sort of week 3, because back they go, never probably to be elected again. So all of these are very sort of thin rafts, frail rafts, but nonetheless, they're worth thinking about.
But the truth is, even without the Fixed Term Parliament Act, if you go back to the history of the 1970s, the Rooker-Wise Amendment, which for a long time was responsible for ensuring that the personal tax allowance went up in line with inflation, was the result of a backbench Labour rebellion backed by the opposition against the government at the committee stage of the Finance Act of the 1970s. The government just had to accept it. The Labour government at one stage during the course of the Liberal Pact wanted to increase fuel duty. The Liberals, who are then virtually overwhelmingly rural constituencies, says, no, we're not backing that. The government had to back down. So even without the security of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the truth is that what politicians began to realise is that actually, and of course the government lost the whole of the Scotland Wales legislation first time around. The truth is governments learn in those circumstances that yes, they lose legislation, and the world does not collapse, because of course at the end of the day they will want to hang on in office because at least they've got the ministerial mondeo, even if they don't necessarily have many levers of power.
Hands,
and
please.
isn't that a more democratic system in the end?
Well, that's for you to think about.
I want to see a couple of women's hands up, please. Time for another female voice. Yes, one there. Thank you. And a gentleman down here next.
Following on from your comments, I just wanted to ask Andrew what he thinks the prospects are of an election before 2020 and what he thinks the result may be then.
Or even a second one in 2015. But
I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act makes it quite unlikely, unless we end up in a situation at this election next week where there's no arithmetic that adds
they
up.
could repeal the act, though, couldn't they?
Well,
only if you've got a majority
you
government.
need majority governments to do it.
Or more, or enough parties to vote.
Well,
for
yeah,
it.
sure, but if you've got enough parties to vote for it, if you've got 2/3, you can dissolve the parliament anyway.
And I mean, the reason we have a Fixed Term Parliament Act is because it was a non-negotiable condition of the Liberal Democrats, because if you look at other countries of Europe which don't have fixed term parliaments, the pattern is invariably that the larger coalition party cuts and runs at the first opportunity and the minority party suffers. So by the same logic, if we have to have another coalition, even if we got rid of it, we'd have to have it back again straight away. And actually, if you're the main opposition party, why would you want to give back to the Prime Minister the control over when we have a general election, which, as John noted, for the first time ever, we haven't. So I think it's unlikely. I think if we did have a second election, there's no reason to think it wouldn't produce the same result anyway, and then we'd be in a real mess.
So whatever emerges, the omens are that it probably would stumble through 5 years.
Well, not necessarily. What you need to realise, the implications of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is that actually holding an election is a card is in the opposition's hands,
yes,
not the government's hands. It's a crucial turnaround because the two conditions are, one, that a vote of no confidence is passed in the government and no new administration is formed within 14 days, or that 2/3 of the House of Commons votes for one, which effectively means, therefore, either that the opposition succeeds in engineering an election by succeeding in getting a vote of confidence through and not forming an administration itself, or because it comes to an agreement with the government. Now, I think the circumstances where you could get an early election is, let us say, for the purpose of argument, let's say it's a Labour minority administration, all right? And much like the Labour administration of the 1970s, it becomes deeply unpopular. Mm-hmm. And it starts losing by-elections. And actually, therefore, its position gets very fragile indeed. And, the Tories have got a few more seats. Maybe there's even another Liberal Democrat back in the House of Commons. And all of a sudden, it looks as though the Tories could bring the government down. And they look at the opinion polls and they see they've got a 10-point lead and they say, right. So in other words, in those circumstances, the Tories might want to choose to, in effect, engineer an early election. And the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, in effect, allows the opposition, if it's got the parliamentary strength to do so, to bring forward an early election. That I think, is a scenario I campaign for you. But otherwise, yeah, the crucial thing anybody who forms a minority government needs to realise is that, in effect, you're entering the lion's cage and you're giving the key to your opponents. That's effectively what it now means.
Gentleman down here.
If on election day getting the vote out is going to be so critical, and given traditionally that the vote in minority and black communities is lower, how important could that vote be for the outcome in the election?
Andrew?
I mean, it will again be very important. I mean, back in 2010, the Tory targeting operation was quite efficient, and they won about, I think from memory, it's about 25 seats that they wouldn't have won on uniform swing, but they also didn't win quite a lot of seats that they should have won on uniform swing, many of them in London, and one of the defining features of those seats was they were seats with a very ethnically diverse population. One of the big long-term challenges the Tory party has is appealing to those voters, and having failed to make much progress during this Parliament, a high turnout among those communities will make a big difference. I suspect it's one of the reasons why the evidence is that Labour are doing particularly well in London at this election.
Yeah.
They're 40, Labour I think are 40% ahead on the black and ethnic minority vote in London. Is that right? Could that be right?
I'd be surprised if it wasn't more than that.
I think 40% is Sadiq Khan's figure, but anyway, hugely ahead. But of course, London is not really representative at all. But it is, and I think it's a sort of touchy point, really, with not with you because you're above all that sort of thing, but with some Tory strategists, their failure to connect with a vote that's growing and growing. We've seen what happened in America. I mean, American parallels aren't all that good. But George H.W. Bush was the last American president who really, last Republican president, who really managed to get a handle on the Hispanic vote. And the loss of that vote to the Democrats has made life very difficult for the Republicans. And I think this is it's not a static thing. It's a changing demographic. And I think unless the Conservative Party do get a handle on that, it is going to become more difficult.
I'd like just to get your thoughts on a word which I think, I can't remember which of you raised it, but anyway, the word was legitimacy. Nick Clegg has used it in explaining why he did not want to start discussing agreements with the second largest party in the House rather than the largest. I looked up the dictionary definition of legitimacy the other day. I mean, there's the obvious definition, legal. But the second definition was capable of being defended with logic or justification. And okay. And I wondered whether there are circumstances, maybe this is a pollster question, in which public revulsion at what they regard to be illegitimate, and I'm thinking of the headlines about Gordon Brown squatting at number 10 5 years ago, whether that might become a factor in the immediate post-election period.
Actually, I think the Gordon, and it's totally unfair that was said of Gordon Brown. He was constitutionally required. In fact, the Constitution he should have stayed longer than he did.
Indeed,
I think actually the Gordon Brown analogy I would draw is the fact that a lot of voters questioned in that sense his legitimacy because he became Prime Minister without an election. And a lot of voters right from the outset resented the fact that the leadership of our country had been handed without even an internal election, and nobody thought they should give the voters a say about that. And once it became clear they weren't going to get a say about it, I think that was one of the big problems that he had. I mean, I think the two things will be in collision with each other, because ultimately what will matter is the brutal arithmetic. What will matter is how can somebody get the minimum number of votes they get in order to get a Queen's speech through the Commons, to get their budget through when they need to survive the vote of confidence.
Sure, but can you not foresee circumstances in which MPs, for example, newly elected MPs, will be saying to their party leaders, the people who voted for us will not understand why the party which did not get most seats is being given a chance.
I think it depends slightly how close they are. I mean, that's one of the things. Lots of the more experienced Labour politicians said that in 2010 when there were still efforts to try to put together a counter deal for the Liberal Democrats and a Labour offer. David Blunkett and John Reid and others went on the media and said that wouldn't be appropriate. It's time for us to step back.
Well, I think that might well be a factor this time, and it's a very interesting point that Andrew raises, because constitutionally, all of this is fine, minority government and so on. So there's no constitutional question, but the legitimacy thing is much more, as Robin suggests, sort of in the air, what voters think, whether they'll buy it or not, whether a government has the trust of the people. But it's also what happens within the parties, and I think this friendly fire, I'm not sure how much of a difficulty it might be for the Conservatives, but I would suspect that it's a worry for some in Labour that if they have, if they are not legitimate in the Nick Clegg sense of the word, there may be a few sort of figures from the past who've got something to say about it. I'm sure the same would go for the Conservatives too.
But you could have a scenario in which the Conservative Party, this is not an unfeasible scenario, the Conservative Party have had the most votes and they have the most seats, though not by a huge margin, but they can't do a deal with the Liberal Democrats, let's say perhaps because Nick Clegg isn't there, and therefore a Labour Party that's come second in terms of votes, is second in terms of seats, is the only way we can have a government. So in a sense, though voters may well feel that is extraordinary and doesn't feel legitimate, doesn't feel that they have a proper mandate.
And what worries me is that could then feed into the disgust idea that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, but just stand back a little bit, however. I mean, we should also remember that the electoral system can produce the wrong winner. And it's in the sense that the party with most votes will not necessarily be the party with most seats, and it's still perfectly possible in a very close situation that that's the position the Labour Party will find itself in. It may get fewer votes because even with its troubles in Scotland, the electoral system, other things being equal, is still going to be biased to the Labour Party because the average Labour constituency contains fewer voters than the average Tory constituency because, hey guys, one of the other things the Tories got wrong in the last 5 years is they failed to get the boundary review through. And that may come back to bite them. But the truth is that in February 1974, I mean, there wasn't a great row about the fact that the Tories had more votes, but they ended up with fewer seats in the Labour Party. And Howard Wilson was not only allowed to carry on, he was allowed to carry on by the Conservative Party, who did not vote against the Queen's speech, which, by the way, is another piece of history that the Conservative Party fails to remind us about, that actually it can completely destroy the SNP's leverage before Queen's speech tomorrow by saying it will abstain on it. End of story.
Yeah. Right. Yes, there's a gentleman there, and then there's one over there.
Hi there. In true political fashion, you have outlined a number of options for the outcome of the election. So to put you on the spot slightly, if you were forced to place 10,000 of your hard-earned pounds on a bet on the colour of the next government, on which government would you place your money?
I wouldn't bet 10,000. I have a £10 bet, which is as far as I'd be willing to go. And my £10 bet is that the next government will be a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition.
Mary?
I'm definitely with the large. I'm a small bet person too. I don't have £10 on anything. But if I were to put my £10 on, I would put it on a Labour minority government.
I have never bet in my life.
What? Not even on the Grand National?
And I don't propose to start doing so now.
Yes.
Hello. Sorry, just two questions. One, someone talked about the parallels with the 1992 election. The Conservatives have certainly tried to make that. I just wonder what the panel think. People seem to forget that the Conservatives had changed their leader within 18 months before that election, and Labour's time for a change from enough people, John Major was enough of a change, I thought, but along with the campaign on tax that the Conservatives think. So is that really a parallel that the Conservatives can draw, given that they haven't changed the leader and didn't win the election last time? And secondly, it alludes to the question the gentleman just asked before. I mean, we're 7 days of campaigning before the next general election. Around 25% of people, I think, will have voted before the election anyway in postal votes, except in Hull North, where they seem to have sent out the postal votes without Labour and another candidate on them. And in Eastbourne, where apparently they've just been stolen this afternoon in the van delivering them. But given that, outside of any act of terrorism or something extraordinary, does this panel see anything happening in the next 7 days that will shift the polls dramatically from what we've seen probably in the last 3 months or so?
Even though over the last 12 months nothing has, I mean, largely.
Well, I think the answer to, and it comes back to the earlier question, I think, well, perhaps 3 points to make about where we're at in the opinion polls. One is, the truth about 1992 is that the polls were wrong. And it's also true that since 1992, the polls have more often than not underestimated the Tories and overestimated Labour. That's one crucial source of uncertainty. The second crucial source of uncertainty is, although there have not been very many of them, those polls that have been conducted by telephone have put the Tories ahead, and those polls that have been conducted by the internet with the vast majority have Labour narrowly ahead. We don't know who's right, who's wrong, and it isn't necessarily simply to do with mode. There are other differences between the companies in this respect, but that's another undoubted source of uncertainty. So to that extent, at least, nobody's really terribly sure what's going to happen. But what I'm now looking at is, the truth is, in the last 2 or 3 days, some of the polls have looked a little bit better for the Tories. And the average that I calculate currently has the Tories very slightly ahead. Now, the truth is, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Labour Party looked so they got narrowly ahead, and then it disappeared. But I think certainly I'm looking to see whether or not that Tory lead is consolidated, and certainly the story about whether or not the suggestion that a Labour SNP government of some form would be a disaster. Whether that's getting through, because certainly YouGov did some, and it comes back to the UKIP point, YouGov did some very good polling on this issue. I mean, the proportion of people in England who are actually the potential target for this audience is very small. It's about 8% of people in England who are already not voting Tory, think there'll be a hung parliament, think that Labour would do a deal with the SNP, and who think that it'll be worse than having the Tories in power. So once you satisfy all those conditions, you get down to 8% of the electorate. But half of them are UKIP supporters. And whether or not that can push some of them, and get 1 or 2% of them back, and the Tories have got themselves a bit of a lead. Now, that said, even with the Tories 1 or 2 points ahead, well, here then we come to the other thing, and you have to realise the other really crucial uncertainty about the outcome is what happens in the marginal seats. Now, experience in recent elections suggests that Conservative MPs defending their seats for the first time, having kicked Labour out last time, that the swing against them will be lower by about a point or two. And given where we are at, according to polls, around a 3 to 4% swing, that can make a crucial difference. And basically, those of you who are kind of following the Newsnight forecast, you're kind of still asking yourself, well, hang on, it's meant to be even Stevens, but they're keeping having the Tories ahead. They're making two crucial assumptions, or they're factoring two things out. One is they think the polls are wrong. Right? They're making a bet that the polls are wrong. And secondly, they are anticipating that one of the sources of variation is that Conservative MPs defending existing seats, one for the first time in 2010, the swing will be lower, and that those two things could put the Tories ahead. Now, whether the polls are wrong, we won't know until May the 8th. Whether there is a bigger swing in lower swing in marginal seats, we won't know on May the 8th. All that we can look for at the moment is whether or not those slight signs of maybe the Tories pushing a little bit of ahead, whether that begins to become more obvious the next few days.
We're running towards the end of our time, but Mary, briefly, the John Major factor in 1992 and what could happen in the next 7 days to change everything?
Well, I think there's definitely something to be said. I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's completely true, that, isn't it? An untried and untested leader. They look a bit novel in a general election campaign. Whereas, you know, if somebody's doing it for the second time, Cameron, Clegg, then, you know, there is this kind of retread thing. It's quite hard. It's that bit harder, I think, to generate any surprise, particularly in a campaign that, as Andrew said, has been pretty uniformly dull. For the change in the last 7 days, look, anything and nothing. You know, I can't personally see anything, but who knows? We've got the debates or the question time tomorrow night. Anything could happen, and this, of course, is what they're both main party leaders
we need an
are
unknown
terrified
unknown,
of.
don't we?
We do. I think you can never rule out an unknown unknown. But I would also, since we're coming to the end, just put in a word for the unknowable British voter, for all the excellent polling and analysis that goes on. And on this platform, you've got, you know, leading examples of both. The British public has a curious way of kind of doing what comes into its head against the arithmetic, against expectations at the last moment. So I think there may yet be some capacity for surprise on the night, large or small.
Andrew?
I mean, the 1992, the Tories certainly cling to the 1992 sort of resonance, and the thing they're thinking about is an election in which the personality and the perceived unfitness to lead of the leader of the opposition, in the end, became a decisive factor at the end. Now, as John says, frustratingly, the opinion polls were wrong in the 1992 election, so we don't really know what happened. We don't know actually the extent to which there really was a late swing. We assume that there was. In terms of John's, I think one of the things Linton Crosby, one of his saws is that you can't fatten the pig on market day, he says. So I think the truth is most voters have formed a settled picture of what they think of the parties and whose side they think those parties are on and what they think their values and motives are. And it is very hard to see anything happening that will cause a significant number of voters to engage, change their view and change their vote. So I don't think we will get a game-changing moment. I think what the issue is that there is a chunk of voters who currently are telling the pollsters they're not going to vote for any of the two main parties, some of whom will, and they will do it reluctantly, and they will do it unenthusiastically, and they'll do it grudgingly and resentfully, and they'll do it late. And where those people come from and where they end up will determine the result. In terms of what's going on in the marginals, obviously we have the utility of this election of Michael Ashcroft, as only a billionaire can. by the end of this year, we'll have done over 200 individual constituency polls, and he puts it all in the public domain. We've been through and analysed seat by seat, and actually could draw two conclusions. Firstly, actually, that the incumbency effect, which is presumed to be there to benefit for the Tories, isn't there in anywhere the consistent pattern that it should be. And secondly, that the Labour Party, contrary to, I think, the conventional wisdom of the press, is doing worse in those seats relative to uniform swing and not better. And if ultimately the final analysis, what's going to matter next Friday, is the ratio of Labour MPs to Tory MPs, that is, on the Ashcroft data, is slightly benefiting the Tories.
Yeah. I've got one final question for each of you, which is a huge question, therefore I will ask each of you to answer in just one sentence. Is it your hunch that the changes that we have been discussing in the British political environment are permanent or temporary? Andrew?
I think that we will look back on this, and as you noted earlier, this is happening in many other countries as well. This is a reaction to globalisation, and I think it will resettle around a new order, but possibly of a very different shape, possibly, as Mary said earlier, under a PR system.
Mary?
Yes, I agree with that. I think it's not obviously on any very set trajectory or pattern yet, but I think something is happening that will turn out to be permanent. I think the old days of two-party winner-takes-all politics are gone in Britain.
John?
Britain's not had a two-party system for 40 years, and I don't see any reason why it should suddenly reacquire one now. What has changed is that British politics doesn't exist anymore, and I don't think that's going to return anytime soon either.
We'll leave it there. Let me, on your behalf, thank all the members of the panel, John Curtice, Mary Riddell, Andrew Cooper. Thank you all very much indeed. It's drinky time.